Pippa. So my name's Verity Warne, as Pippa said, and I'm an Associate Marketing Director at Wiley in the author marketing team. And my particular role is looking at how we're developing services around engaging with peer reviewers. So as Pippa said, I was going to spend some time today talking a little bit about some results of a study that we did last year. And we had responses from about 3,000 reviewers. And also some other data that I was sort of poring over, particularly for this session, to look at who is undertaking review and how the balance of the burden of peer review is spread out across different regions. So Pippa very neatly sort of talked through my first 3 slides. But I'm going to do it anyway. So just very quickly wanted to recap on where we are, the sort of narrative arc around peer review right now. So firstly, reassuringly, we know that researchers are invested in and value peer review and essentially agree that peer review does make science better. And these are, as Anthony will recognise, some results from this year's PRC study. So it's not surprising then that a huge amount of researcher time is spent reviewing, although quite how much time they spend reviewing is pretty staggering when you look at it in these big figures. And this is a figure that Rubric came up with in 2013, and we also at Wiley looked at just the top 12 publishers alone for 2013 and estimated that at least 22 million researcher hours were spent reviewing papers just for the top 12 publishers. So it's a really big time commitment. However, despite the value of peer review and the time spent doing it, there's plenty of work that needs to be done. And we're far from being ready to pack up and congratulate ourselves and go home, which I guess is why we're all here. So people are recognising, obviously, again, as we all know, that there's things that could be improved about peer review. So I'm focusing in today on one particular issue around peer review, and that is an issue that we see a lot, hear a lot from editors, which is the finding researchers who are willing to undertake peer review for them. In fact, in a recent study or survey that we did of Wiley researchers, finding reviewers was what they said was their number one pain point, way above all of the other problems that they faced. Getting reviewers to agree to review for them was the thing they struggled with the most. And looking at sort of the top level figures for journals that we have using Scholar One, on average, we find we're inviting about 4.5 reviewers in order to get to completed reviews, but there's a huge amount of variation beneath that figure. So for some journals, it's much, much more than 4.5 reviewers. Which half? I'm not sure about. No. So also this problem isn't just perceived by editors. Again, using the results from the PRC WARE report, about 30% of researchers feel that this is a problem. In fact, to the point of believing that the current system of review is unsustainable due to the size of the pool in comparison to the demand for reviewing activity. So in general, researchers tell us that they're refereeing an average of 2 papers per month. And in our survey, 49% of respondents told us that they're currently reviewing for at least 5 journals. Experienced reviewers reported that they were reviewing for a much higher number than that. So people are telling us that they're undertaking a lot of review, but in practice, it sometimes appears that the burden of review often falls on the same reviewers. So it's not surprising then that we also see a correlation between the number of review requests that a researcher receives and the number of review requests that they decline. And in our survey from last year, researchers told us that they generally would prefer to review fewer manuscripts than they're currently asked to review. Some, those who are only reviewing 1 a month, said they would review more, but everybody else was saying they would much rather review less than they currently are. So, who is bearing the current review burden? Well, it's been suggested that fair reviewer commons would be one in which researchers review the same number of papers as they themselves receive review for. And as editors are frequently asking past authors to be reviewers, there could be an assumption that as the number of authors grows, so should the number of reviewers. When we asked in our survey about the volume of reviews that people were undertaking, we had similar responses globally. So people in all different parts of the region reported that they were doing about the same amount of reviewing. But when we look at the geographical distribution of reviewers across our journals compared to the geographical distribution of submissions from authors, we have a slightly different insight into reviewer workload. So I looked at Wiley journals that use ScholarOne and analysed data for the 5 journals with the highest volume of submissions in 2015 for each of our major subject disciplines, so health science, life science, physical science and social sciences. So that's 20 journals in total that we're looking at right here today. And those 20 journals account for about 14% of the total submissions that we receive for journals that we have using ScholarOne. So there's lots of qualifiers in this data. It is really a snapshot of 20 journals, but I think it's still interesting data. So looking at that information, I then calculated what percentage of total submissions from corresponding authors that each country contributed by journal, and then did the same for reviewers. And here are the results. So if this fair reviewer commons exists or is to be taken as true, then so if authoring effort and reviewing effort were balanced, then you'd expect each country that I'm about to show you would line up along this diagonal line here. And looking at the aggregate data across these 20 journals, I took the top 10 countries in terms of submissions and then plotted them on this chart. And this is a very simplified version of the chart, just to try and make it a bit more legible for you. So it's good to see that there's a fair few countries that are lining up nicely, or broadly speaking, along this line. So top marks go to Brazil, Italy, Spain, France and Germany, who are pretty much spot on the line in terms of balance of reviewer versus author effort. Countries that are in this top triangle here to the left are those who are authoring or submitting more than they're reviewing, and those at the bottom are the ones who are reviewing more than they're submitting. So there are 2 notable exceptions on this chart, and that is the US and China. So both these countries, when I was looking at these 20 journals, provided the highest volume of reviewers in terms of numbers. But when you look at the proportion of reviewing versus authoring effort, it paints quite a striking picture. So the US are reviewing way more proportionately than they're submitting, and the reverse is true for China. So this is across all 20 of these journals. And then this next chart is looking at it by subject, but just for these 2 outliers. So this is the aggregate for China and US. And then there is some difference. So in physical sciences, for example, the proportion of authoring versus US is much less balanced for US, but way more for China. HS, in health sciences, the US was off the chart, so I couldn't even put it on the page. This is life science, so life science plots very well against the average, and this is SSH, where not very much sort of authoring is coming from China at the moment. So this apparent regional imbalance could be one explanation for the increasing difficulty in finding reviewers, and also the burden of a growing number of articles without a commensurate growth of reviewers. So anecdotally, we've heard that editors often tell us that Chinese researchers actually have a higher review invitation acceptance rate. So if they're asked to review, they're more likely to say yes than researchers in other countries. So I looked at the figures to see if this was accurate. Again, this is a snapshot, because when you're looking at this kind of data, if you have one person who was invited to review from Kazakhstan and that one person said yes, that's 100% review invitation acceptance rate. But bearing in mind that China and US are both high volume reviewers, I think these figures are to a certain extent reliable. So the figures do suggest that the anecdotal evidence that we have from editors is correct, that 61% of Chinese researchers, the review acceptance rate from Chinese researchers is 61%, and it's 46% from US. So Chinese researchers are saying yes to reviews more than US at the moment. So the PRC survey found that 46% of researchers decline review invitations because they're too busy. In our survey, we had a slightly lower figure than that. We had about 33% who said they decline invitations because they're too busy. But that could have been because of the way we were asking the question. Anyway, these are from Wiley's figures of China and US. And at the moment, we asked people how often why they declined review invitations over the past 12 months. And researchers from China said 20% of them said it was because they're too busy versus 38% from the US. So we sort of asked the too busy question in two ways. We asked people if they were too busy doing their own research or lecturing, and then if they were too busy with reviewing commitments. I think this is also interesting because here in China, only 5% say that they're too busy with other reviewer commitments compared to the 13% in the US. So, if Chinese researchers are more likely to accept an invitation to review and are less likely to decline because they're too busy, why aren't there more of them? Well, the first question, I guess, for me anyway, was, well, who are we actually asking to bear the reviewer burden? And I think this is also really interesting. Again, bearing in mind this is just for these 20 journals, but here's a quick reminder of the percentage of reviewers plotted against the percentage of authors. And here is the same chart, but looking at how many reviewers we invited versus those who author. And as you can tell, it's exactly the same. So we're not asking Chinese reviewers to share the burden of review. And I think this leads on to some other really interesting questions. And I'm going to try and sort of break those down one by one. But it's possible, probable even, that more emphasis is being placed on the importance of authoring over reviewing in some high-growth markets, such as China and some other emerging markets. So let's take that particular question and look at motivations for reviewing. So in our study, we had questions about sort of general recognition of review in the research community. And in total, across all global areas, respondents in our survey strongly believe that reviewing is inadequately acknowledged at present and should carry more weight in their institution's evaluation process. And they also said they'd spend more time reviewing if their institution recognised this task more formally. So this is a quick look at those same kind of figures, but pulling out again US and China. So 60% of Chinese reviewers felt that reviewing should be recognised by research assessment bodies or their institution, compared though to 79% in the US and 80% overall. So in China there was less kind of agreement with this statement that reviewing should be recognised formally. And then 7 out of 10 US responders felt that reviewing wasn't sufficiently recognised right now, compared to 5 out of 10 Chinese respondents. So at the moment, Chinese reviewers aren't feeling the need as strongly as other reviewers for institutional recognition. But interestingly, when we asked, would you spend more time reviewing if your institution did recognise, or if reviewing was more formally recognised, 75% of Chinese reviewers said yes, they would spend more time reviewing, compared to a lower 60% of US reviewers, I guess again because the US feel they're already at their kind of maximum capacity. So what about looking at general motivations to review? Well, again, I think probably everyone will be very familiar with this. the results from our survey confirm the findings from a lot of other studies that reviewers choose to review, or they say they choose to review because it allows them to actively participate in the research community, and they feel it's important to reciprocate the review that they themselves receive. There are some differences under those figures by career stage. So reviewing as a part of improving one's writing skills and building reputation is higher ranked by those who have less reviewing experience, so the kind of more early career researchers. So looking specifically at the results for US and China again, as with researchers across the full pool, Chinese researchers told us that being an active participant in their researcher community was the most influential factor for them in choosing to become a reviewer. But improving their writing skills, although it's second for both the US and the UK, actually received a higher kind of mean rating in China than it did in the US. And I think also for me, these other aspects sort of suggest that in the US at the moment, it's much more about it's an expected thing that you undertake. There's a culture, an expectation around doing a review, whereas in China, some of the kind of responses suggest that perhaps being a reviewer is more about developing a professional reputation and kind of recognition in your community. So the top factor influencing the decision to accept a specific review invitation, so if a journal asks you what makes you decide to say yes to that invitation, is, again, across the board, the prestige and reputation of the journal who's asking you. And that holds true across all age groups and all regions, and I guess isn't really surprising. But what this does tell us is that whilst reviewers say that they choose to review in order to give back to their community, there is obviously more of a perceived benefit in interacting with the community of a top-ranking journal than a lower-ranking one. So across the board, there's obviously some reputation management, career progression factors involved here. And again, here are the sort of specifics for China and US. So I think what was interesting here is that Chinese respondents are ranking the feedback that journal is going to give you more highly than the US counterparts are. So again, maybe there's a sort of recognition that this is about developing your skills and your reputation. So, am I run out of time? Okay. Very, very quickly to add to the warp speed that I already talk at. Essentially, yes, there are some differences in motivations to review, but the motivation's still there. So still, why aren't we asking more Chinese reviewers to review? Is there an issue around editorial trust and confidence in the reviewing standards of reviewers from some regions? Or is it more difficult for editors from international journals to find referees from China because they don't know where to look? Could training support attract reviewers from this area and also help provide evidence of reviewing skill? And maybe we could also tailor our recognition and reward efforts to appeal to a range of different needs. So I do have a couple more slides touching on some of those issues, but I'll go through them very quickly. Essentially, this one, we asked people, how did you first become a reviewer? And most people say it's having authored a paper. And that's, again, consistent. But what I thought was interesting was we gave people an option to say that they'd been approached by an editor that they didn't have within their networks originally. And here, China has a much lower response rate than US, which perhaps suggests that particularly early career researchers don't have those kind of access to personal networks at the moment that perhaps researchers in the US do, if you've got an editorial board or that's sort of dominated by US editors, I guess. So different ways of helping alleviate this situation. Here are just some very kind of flashing up some brief ideas. Obviously, identifying potential reviewers is a big issue. How are we going to find them? And I think that's where the investment in infrastructure that's powered by the plumbing that's provided by organisations like ORCID and Publons could really help with this. Also, training. In our survey, 77% of reviewers across the board said they would be interested in getting training, but there's much more interest in China than I thought was a very high number, but in China it's even higher. So people do want training, and when we looked at specifically the topics they wanted training in, how to become a reviewer is a particular question in Asia, Middle East, North Africa, so sort of emerging markets. And my last thing is about preferred recognition initiatives. So this is looking specifically at what a journal can do to incentivize reviewers to review for them. Again, across the board, the thing that people said that they valued the most was broad recognition, so not payments, but sort of feedback, acknowledgement of the time they've spent, so sort of satisfying the human need to get a thank you for the time you've spent doing something, but also kind of getting feedback from it. And when we, again, splitting out the Chinese and US responses, the US is expressing a stronger desire for public acknowledgement. China expresses a stronger desire to be compensated with forms of professional credit, certificates, performance-based rewards. But both have an equal desire for editorial feedback in forms of visibility of review reports, knowing what the ultimate editorial decision was on the outcome of their paper, and so on. So, in conclusion, this is my last slide. These are the things I think that we need to do, but I think also we need to recognise that there is a no one-size-fits-all approach to doing these things, and whilst publishers need to provide the infrastructure across their platform of journals, the journals themselves then might want to try and find different ways of enacting those initiatives, be more flexible in developing their own recognition and reward approaches that best suit the needs of their particular researcher community, both their current researcher community and their desired researcher community.
Thank you very much, Verity. Really interesting talk. What I propose to do is that if anybody has any burning questions, we can take them now, but I'd like to try and leave a little bit of space at the end for more general questions, because you may find it would be nice to get different opinions from the panel. So with that in mind, I'd like to invite Janne-Tuomas Seppänen from Peerage of Science, where he's the founder and managing director. So thinking on what Verity's talked about, to now move on to how do we support reviewers, and perhaps particularly thinking of reviewers in China, so we can get more of them, get more reviews. So if I'd like to hand over to you, thank you.
Thank you. My name is Janne-Tuomas Seppänen. I'm the founder of Peerage of Science, and I'm here to talk about quality control for peer review. The first question there is, of course, why on earth? I mean, peer review is supposed to be the tool for quality control rather than the subject of quality control. Because, of course, I mean, peer reviews are always carefully written, and they're never biased or incompetent, and they're always equally good. But then if you talk to researchers, you'll find out that quite a few of them have encountered incompetent or biased peer reviews. But that often happens when they get rejected by a journal. You will never find an author who is going to complain that this incompetent peer reviewer praised my manuscript to the high heavens, and then it got accepted and published, and it was never cited in the next 10 years. As a publisher, you might be a bit unhappy about that peer reviewer. And you'll never find an author who is complaining that this biased peer reviewer skipped mentioning the deadly methodological flaw, but then you as a publisher get featured in Retraction Watch. So there's this beautiful live document, which is actually might be the future of publishing, by Neil Saunders, following the retraction notices in PubMed from 1966 to 2016 per 100,000 articles. And something quite tremendous has happened in the past 10 years. Now, you might argue that, well, that is only because there is this proliferation of poor journals around. Well, but in your heart, you know that that is not really true, that retractions are actually more common in the high-profile journals. So as the academic community and also the publishing industry, we need to come together and admit that peer reviews are not equal. Some of them are brilliant pieces of science that stand on their own merit and forward things. Most of them are useful for the editors and perhaps even to the authors, but some of them are harmful pieces of bullshit that are a waste of everybody's time, including the reviewer's own time. And we need to act accordingly after acknowledging that fact. So how do we do it? The first thing is that we need to tell the peer reviewers that a couple of sentences hastily scribbled on a Friday evening just before your departmental beers is not sufficient. So in Peerage Science, we greet the peer reviewers with this text. We're telling them that you need to write an essay that has a standardized structure, that is following the scientific writing conventions, that has a limited length of 1,000 words in total. If you also want to tell the authors that they need to fix the typo on line 7, you can do that in additional comments, the length of which we are not restricting, but you need to write something that is solid, that can be used by the editors, and that's readable and usable for the journal. So the sections that we require them to do is merits, description of what is good about the manuscript, or statement that there is absolutely nothing good about this manuscript. They need to tell that too. Critique, telling that what are the weaknesses and problems of the manuscript, or using this section to say that there is absolutely no weaknesses in this work. And importantly, the reviewer also must provide insight. What are the implications of this research? What is the importance of this research? Because those are probably going to be the most valuable pieces for an editor after they've determined that this is actually solid science, especially if they are making publishing decisions based on the expected impact of the work. Or if the work has problems, then the peer reviewer should tell the authors that how could it be improved. So that is then the object that is presented to authors and editors in the system. We also tell the peer reviewers that they should provide categorical revision recommendations about different aspects of the manuscript. Because sometimes the writing might be good, but the data is in need of a major revision. And these are separate things. But we want to emphasize that this is not the peer review. This is just a quick color-coded guide to help editors look at it quickly. The actual essay is built from those parts that you fill out. Merits, critique, discussion. An introduction to tell the editors what is the content of the manuscript, because they're not going to bother to actually read it, at least not after they've read the peer reviews. And that is then the object that the peers will be judging and scoring. So after all the peer reviews are in, by the deadline that the author specified upon submission, the peer reviewers are asked to judge and score each other on how accurate and justified the peer review was, on each of those three aspects. And so at the end of each of the sections, they can see a button showing, come on, now, that saying score this section. So it's right there embedded in the document on the website. And we're asking them to give a score for that section. And importantly, we're telling them that you should lower the score if there's lack of acknowledgement where acknowledgement was due, or if there is support for the manuscript, praising the manuscript when it shouldn't be praised, that should also lower the score. And the same goes for critique. We're telling them that if there is something to criticize in the manuscript and the reviewer is failing to criticize that, that should lower the score, but so should unjustified critique. People should justify their arguments. And this important part about discussion is also saying that essays should go beyond simply saying that this is publishable, not publishable, but actually offer a discussion. Why? What are the implications, the importance? How could it be improved? So if there is no original contribution from the reviewer, it's not a very good essay. There should be some new scientific value because they are, after all, experts in that field. They should be able to provide that. Now, something as complex as scientific manuscript or a peer review cannot be distilled into a single number or even 3 numbers. So that's why we're also emphasizing that in the evaluation stage, they should also provide written feedback, at least a short statement about the reviewer's performance, but ideally also detailed comments about where they agree or disagree with the peer reviewer and justifying their scoring. And I'm happy to say that most often people do fill this also out. They do want to elaborate where they agree or disagree. So we're asking peer reviewers to do this new thing. And editors will tell you that it's hard enough in the first place to get them to the old style. So will they do this? One way to look at this is to look at the completion times. In peer review science, the authors define the deadlines for the different stages of the peer review. Most of them go with the defaults that we suggest to them. So about 80% choose the 7-day window for the peer review stage. And you know how it is when you give somebody a week deadline? That means that on day 8, you are asking that when are you returning that? For this particular thing, if we're looking at when things get completed, from the second that they get the email telling them that now it's possible to go into the service and that peer reviews are going to be visible and you can go and judge and score them, actually quite many do it within 6 hours of getting that peer review. So basically immediately. And the median time to completing that task is a little under 2 days. So this is telling me that people are actually curious to see what are the other people saying about this work that I just spend, hopefully, a full day of thinking about and writing about. And then eager to give those people scores and feedbacks. And they also see their role in improving the quality of peer review in doing that. So we know now that scientists are happy to do this. They're actually eager to do this. Does it do any good? And one window into this, if not into the quality, but at least to the amount of time and effort people are willing to put into peer reviewing, is to look at the length of the peer reviewing text. So I was curious to know what is significant length and detail for a peer review text. I know what is happening in our system, but I was curious to know what happens in journals. What do editors think about this? Thankfully, there's a brilliant magazine around called Learn Publishing that published an article just in January about the internal peer review quality scoring system at a fairly respected medical journal, the Journal of Bone and Joint Surgery. And they were telling in that article that they have 4 categories for length of peer reviewing text. This is 1 or 2 sentences is considered to be a very brief peer review. I agree that it's very brief. I don't agree that it's actually a review. 3 to 4 sentences is called succinct review. 50 to 100 words in their world is moderate volume, and 200 to 500 plus is a significant length and detail. I was rather shocked to read this paper because in our system, that is the median length of an essay. And that is a structured document that has introduction, merits, critique, discussion, and often a list of references. That word count doesn't go equally between the different sections. So that's actually an interesting point here, is that when people are describing the merits of the manuscript, the median amount of words that they use is 57. And then when they're describing the weaknesses and problems of the manuscript, they use 5 times the amount of words on that. And then something in between for discussing the scientific importance of that. Actually, I think that shows that peer reviewers largely see their role as being guardians against bad science, and that their job is to find the problems, and if they can't find any, then it must be a great paper. Which is not necessarily a bad thing, but I would hope that the culture could change a little bit about comparing also the merits of the manuscript. Of course, length of a text is not equal to its quality. I mean, if there's 5 pages of rambling, that's almost as useless as 1 sentence or 2 sentences. But at least for the critique section, the scores that people give in our system are correlated with the length of that section. So if it's really short, like 10, 20 words, it tends to get a low score. The longer it gets, the better quality it's perceived to be. But it's not terribly strong, which is also a good thing, because if somebody explains something succinctly, that's a good thing, rather than rambling along. That's the score distribution for PEQ, which is an average of those 3 different sections. across all the essays in our system so far. I'm quite happy to see that it's heavy on the right side, although I don't really know. It might just reflect the human nature of not picking the extremes on a 1 to 5 scoring scale. What we'd really need to do is to have an independent study of experienced editors looking side to side, Peerage of Science essays, and then peer reviews from a journal on the same manuscript, which I know we can get from the authors. I'm not sure that the journals would be willing to give them to us because we want to find out that ours are better, but the authors will probably give them to us. Another measure of whether people use time and effort to do the peer reviews is to look at whether they actually bother to justify their arguments with references to literature. And 54% of Peerage of Science essays actually have a list of references justifying the arguments. And in the end of the day, of course, the final judgment of whether this works is whether journals are willing to use it, and in our case also whether they're willing to pay for it. So we have quite a few publishers already participating in the platform. But I want to emphasize this, that nothing that what we do is proprietary. So instituting peer review of peer review stage is something that you can do on your own in your journals. Although I'm, of course, more than happy to sell it to you. A very important thing about doing judgment and scoring in a transparent and public way is that it allows us to have a meaningful academic recognition system. So instead of counting the number of times you've done peer reviews, or even worse, counting the impact factors of the journals where you've done peer reviews, which is wrong on so many levels, it makes me want to cry. This is a system where you can, if you want to have academic recognition for peer review, it has to be commensurate with the value of the academic contribution. So we're doing it, one of the things that we're doing it with is one of the public profiles that people have, but then also the reviewer prize, which we give out every year, which is based on the quantitative performance that you have in the system. So your average score squared and multiplied by the time of number of essays you've done. Jessica from Sweden won it in 2012, then there's Jan from Germany and Staffan from UK, and somebody who will be revealed next week. Sorry, the Freudian slip there. Can't be you. I already know who it's going to be, but you can aim for the 2017 then. It's a trophy, lots of praise, and €1,000. Finally, I want to answer a weird question that I often get. What is your success rate in Peerage of Science? And I want to answer by describing a very successful peer review process. The author submitted a paper. I'm not going to show you the title. That would be breach of anonymity or of privacy, but they essentially say that there is this established model that doesn't work with real-world data that attracted 4 peer reviews, which were sharply critical, one of them actually saying that the whole inference should be discarded, and going into rather some length in describing all the problems of the manuscript, and justifying that criticism with a long list of references. Then they commented on each other. The guy who was, or the girl who was most critical got this kind of feedback: very complete and detailed assessment of the weaknesses of the manuscript, very helpful for the authors. The one who was sort of almost accepting some of their arguments got feedback saying that I think the reviewer did not realize several important weaknesses of the manuscript. The authors got royally trashed by the peer reviewers, so much that they never actually even sent a revised version, but the peer reviewer still provided a final evaluation based on the original manuscript, saying that this work is not publishable. To me, that is a successful peer review process, because if work that shouldn't be published ends up not published because of peer review, that is a successful peer review process. Thank you.
Janne-Tuomas, thank you very much. That was a really interesting talk again. I'm going to be slightly repetitious and plagiarise myself by saying really interesting probably several times. So I'd now like to hand over to Michaela. Michaela Torkar is the editorial director of F1000 Research, and she's going to speak about their experiences using a unconventional peer reviewing and publishing methodology. So I look forward to hearing about it. Michaela.
Thank you. So I'm going to take a step back and just think briefly about our role as publishers and editors in the whole process, and think about how we can really put the research community back at the heart of publishing and peer review in particular, and I'll describe our somewhat different model on F1000 research and what we've developed here to address some of the issues with publishing and peer review. So to start with, I think it's always important to remember that a lot of the processes we have in place have been there for decades, if not centuries, and some of the limitations were defined by content being distributed in print. But those limitations aren't necessarily in place anymore, but we haven't really changed our processes very much. The editors and referees have traditionally been the gatekeepers of what is published, selecting the types of research that should be, or the research findings generally that should be distributed amongst the community, and the question is whether that is the right approach when you bear in mind that the traditional processes have a number of potential problems. They can often introduce delays. It can take months, if not years, before authors are able to publish their articles, because the peer review can sometimes take a long time. The processes aren't always transparent. There's a potential for bias at various stages. We know that there can be problems with reproducibility sometimes. There's a publication bias in the published literature. And of course, a lot of research, or valuable research, never gets published, and there's a real waste in the system. Research is increasingly being shared and used in very different ways. We have a real opportunity to go beyond a traditional article format and also beyond the journal format, we know. We have increasingly better technology and infrastructure in place to help facilitate a change. And we think there's a real opportunity for publishers to rethink their role and make some changes. And there are certainly new models being developed, such as discussions around preprints and the post-publication peer review that I'll talk about in a minute, that give an opportunity to put the research community back at the heart of the whole process. So what we've done with F1000 research, and that's been going now for more than 3 years, is develop a very different publishing model. It's an open science publishing platform. It's not a journal in the same way, but the content we publish is very similar to traditional articles. It's set up specifically for life sciences, and it has some key features of open science. It is an open access platform. The peer review is open. The methodology is open, and we have a very strong open data policy, which I won't talk too much about, because this is about peer review primarily. So one of our key aims is to make sure that research can be distributed very quickly and in an unrestricted way, and that we make it easy for researchers to publish big studies and small studies, negative findings, confirmatory findings, as much as novel insights and exciting work that they have. All of this is aimed at reducing the waste in the research and improving or having less of a publication bias in the literature. Everything we do is built around a concept of transparency, which we hope will help increase research integrity generally. And by having an open data policy, we hope to improve reproducibility as well. So how does this work? We do post-publication peer review. That's at the core of what we do. We don't have editors in the same way as you have in a traditional journal. We have an editorial team that does a quality hygiene check, if you like, on the submissions. So we look for to make sure that ethical policies are met, that say patient consent is in place, and those things that the paper is in the scope, that it is a scientific study, that the methods are described in sufficient detail for reviewers to be able to judge what's been done, and that the data underlying the findings are openly available for others to be able to interrogate them in detail. But once those checks are met, the paper is published, usually on average within 7 days of submission. And then we start a formal invited peer review using expert referees in the same way as you would do on a traditional journal. But all of this is fully transparent. We publish the peer reviews alongside the paper with the referees' names. And we have a concept of living articles whereby we publish multiple versions. So I can show you this in a bit more detail. When we have developed a citation format which indicates at all stages of the process at what stage in the peer review the article is. So in this example, the article's undergone peer review, and there are a total of 3 referees' reports, so you can see this in the title. Each article has what we call our open peer review box on the right next to the title and abstract, so you can't miss it as a reader. And it gives you all the information you need about the peer review that's happened with this article. So in this case, you have the 3 referees. You know who they are, at what institute they are, so you can identify them easily. If you want to know about their expertise, you can look them up. And what's more, you can actually read the report that they have provided for this article. In this particular example, you can see that when the authors published originally, there was one referee who gave a somewhat critical report, which the authors then addressed by publishing a second version. So, as I said, it is open peer review which gives full credit to the peer reviewers, and we talked about the motivation and incentives for referees to do this. So this is increasingly important that referees are really recognized for all the hard work that they do. So we name the referees, we give a DOI to each referee report, so the report can be cited in its own right. You can see how often a referee report has been accessed by the view count, and the referee report and in fact the author comments are all part of the history of the peer review. So we've taken the editor out of the equation in many ways as the gatekeeper of what gets published, because it's ultimately the author's responsibility. They are fully accountable for it. They decide what they want to share with the community. But with this system, there's a much more direct communication, if you like, between the referees. So the referees and the authors. The referee have an opportunity to give a score, or they have to give a score on, alongside their report. They can choose between 3 different approval statuses. So they can either approve the article if it is basically fine. They might still have a few minor queries, but nothing that should that is a major issue or should be problematic to address. They can approve it with reservations, which would be equivalent to major revisions in a traditional peer review process. So when they might ask for an extra control, or they have some real serious questions, and a revision would really be required to address those. Or if there are fundamental problems and flaws with the article, they might give a not approved when they really think that this is hard to fix. The level of approval the referees provide decides whether the article is indexed in PubMed and Scopus and other bibliographic databases. So until the article has passed peer review, it isn't listed in those databases, but it is fully published and available on our site. And so coming back to the example that I gave you earlier, you can see how the peer review progressed, because the authors have an opportunity to address the criticisms by publishing a new version. And in this example on the right, for example, with the version 2, the referee 1, who had given and approved with reservations, was obviously happy with the responses and then approved the corrections and version 2. So again, it's very much the authors in the driving seat here. It's not the editors who decide what the author needs to do. The author is motivated to get the paper indexed in PubMed, so if there are criticisms from the referees, they have a good incentive to revise and address those points, but it's ultimately up to the authors to decide at what point, whether and at what point they provide a revision. But they can revise their article at pretty much any stage in order to address referee criticisms, or in fact, even after the article has passed peer review, they might decide to update it again at a later stage when there are some new developments, some small changes that would be useful for readers to have. And we've got a dynamic citation format and a way of alerting readers that there may be a new version, so the default version will always be the latest, but if you have bookmarked an older version and come back to the site, there's an alert that there have been some changes. And if an article has passed peer review and is indexed in PubMed, all the versions are also there, and in PubMed the latest version will be listed as the default. And people also have if you're interested in a particular article, you can track it and get alerts when there are changes. So with this model that we have developed, we think we can really redefine our role as publisher very much as a service provider. We have given the referees and the authors an opportunity to communicate without an editor as the moderator in between. We facilitate the process, we administer it at F1000, but it is ultimately up to the referees and the authors to communicate about the actual science and how it should be shared. So we can really redefine our role, and in a first step towards this, we have recently announced a new initiative that was developed with Wellcome Trust. It's called Wellcome Open Research. This is a really exciting new project which gives us at F1000 a different role as a publisher. This is a publishing platform which is very much modeled on how we operate on F1000 research. We're planning to publish in later this year in November. At the moment it's still a site just for people to find information on. This publishing platform is specifically for Wellcome funded researchers. It's a chance for them to share all sorts of all different types of research that they want to share with the research community. The features of Wellcome Open Research are very similar to what we've developed on F1000 Research and what I have just presented. So it's a post-publication peer review. It's an we have an open data policy. So again, the researchers will have to make the source data available. All sorts of different research outputs will be suitable here. Big and small findings, novel and confirmatory insights will all be suitable. The interesting thing about this model is really that the platform is owned and controlled by Wellcome as the funder, and F1000 is running the services in the background. Wellcome will fund the article processing charges for Wellcome Open Research directly. But this gives us an opportunity to really think about our role in a very different way. And that's me done. Okay.
Michaela, thank you very much. And I think that gives a new definition to a flipped journal, flipping it from a gatekeeper to an access enabler. I think it's good. I'd like to introduce Varsha Khodiyar from Nature, the Nature Journal Scientific Data. And Varsha is the data curation editor, so to talk about the difficulties and challenges of reviewing and quality controlling data. Varsha.
Thank you. Yeah, that's me. So I'm just going to introduce a little bit about the journal itself and then explain about how we go forward with the peer review process. So we have our main article type is the data descriptor, which is our name for a data paper. We are just looking at sound science here, so we're just looking for something that allows data to be reused and has been described adequately to allow that reuse. So we're not looking for novelty at this journal. We also have other article types that we accept, so analysis articles that may reuse data sets, what we call an article, confusingly, which is an original report that advances data sharing in some way, and a comment piece, which usually they tend to be invited, but they might be a perspective from somebody about some aspect of data publication or data sharing. So just to, if you're not familiar, in case you're not familiar with what a data paper is, this is how it differs from a normal article. So the data paper will provide the context of how the data was generated. It will provide the background information. If there's any processing, we have a code availability policy so that the code must be shared if it's custom code that has been created for that project. And very importantly, where the data is. And the data paper allows linking from the paper to the data in whichever repository it resides in. The corresponding article is your traditional, in this case it's a Nature letter. It provides you the synthesis of the results of analysis and drawing conclusions from what that data may show. So we don't get any of that in the data paper. There's no conclusions, there's no drawing, there's no analysing the data in a data paper. At a data descriptor, we have two aspects. We have the human readable HTML, PDF that everyone's familiar with. And we also have a machine readable representation of the study, so what we call metadata. We're using the ISOTAB format at the moment, which is just a way to describe what happened to the samples and how they became data in a machine readable way. And this is my role in particular at the journal, is to create the ISOTAB files for each of our data descriptors. We provide guidance to authors because we're familiar that people don't necessarily know how to write a data paper. What do they need to put in? So we do try to provide some very kind of comprehensive but hopefully not too dense guidance on our website. We try and make it really simple. Essentially, if, as an author, you need to put your data in the right place for that type of data. So if it's genetic data, it must be the NCBI or EBI database, and there's several different repositories for different types of data that we list on our website, which I'll talk about in a minute. You then upload your manuscript. You can't actually complete manuscript submission unless you have some kind of identifier for your data. So you have to say where your data is in order to actually complete manuscript submission. And then we've got several different bits where we describe our policies and things on our website for this. This is the recommended repository page that I alluded to earlier. So another part of my role is to actually maintain this repository list. So at the moment, we've got just over 80 repositories across all of disciplines. That list is growing all the time as new repositories come to us. And we have an evaluation process which we try to make as simple as possible for repository managers, but make it so that we can understand what that repository is about, what kind of files they accept, if there are any limits. So if some repositories might only be open to submission from a certain community, for example, if there's any costs involved for authors or for data depositors, and based on our evaluation of this, repositories that we feel that we can then recommend more widely to our authors, we would list on our website. We also accept the use of repositories like institutional repositories, which are only open to researchers from that institution. But we wouldn't list those on our website because they're not widely accessible. But But all of this information is on the website, so you can see where repositories might fit in. So we get authors coming to us with a data in a new repository. We then go through an evaluation process, usually in conjunction with that paper being sent out to peer review, with the idea being that once that paper is accepted, the repository it's going to be in is already decided, and then it all comes together at publication. We get authors coming to us with highly unsuitable repositories, in which case we have to gently guide them to a more suitable repository. We have had a case where a paper was stuck in peer review because the peer reviewers said clearly this data is not in the right repository. And until the authors moved their data to the correct repository for that very specific type of data, the paper could not be published. And I think that was completely correct in that case. So the review process. So we have, these are the editors at the journal. So there's Susanna Sansoni, who's our academic editor. There's Andrew Houghton, who's the managing editor, and myself as the data curation editor. We're the first ones to kind of read each article as it comes in and make a decision as to whether it's within scope or out of scope for the journal. So if it's out of scope, we aim to get back to authors very quickly so they're free to then send their papers elsewhere. We don't want to waste people's time. The next level of review would be editorial board members, and we're very selective about who we invite onto the editorial board. So they must be obviously experts in their discipline, but also they must have demonstrated expertise in data use and data stats or whatever it is in their particular field that's relevant. So we have a very great actually board of editorial board members who we can then decide which articles go to the right person in each discipline. Our editorial board members then will know people in their field who will be suitable for reviewing this article. So then those reviewers are invited to review the article by the editorial board members. And we give guidance to the reviewers. So we ask them to look at the experimental rigor and the technical data quality. This is relevant more for data that is maybe in a generalist repository and less relevant for data that is in a subject-specific repository. Because the subject-specific repositories, they will do their own quality control in order to actually get the data into a repository. But then if you're working in the field, you would know that, so then you get an idea of how much review you need to do. Very importantly, the reviewers are asked, is there sufficient detail to allow others to reproduce the steps that are described here? So often you'll get the reviewers saying, you need a bit more detail here, or this technique isn't quite described correctly, and that's the kind of feedback our authors tend to get. Is there enough detail to allow others to reuse the data set? This is another really important part of it, and we have a section in the data descriptor called the usage notes, which is an optional section, but we find that the manuscripts that include that section to start with are much stronger. And again, discipline specific, there will be minimum reporting standards in different disciplines, and that's something else we ask the reviewers to check, that they've actually used the reporting standards for that discipline. And then a general overlook of the data files themselves. Are they complete? Do they match what's described in the manuscript? And as I mentioned earlier, are they archived in the most appropriate repository? So assuming it's gone through that, and it might go through a round or two of revision in order to make sure the manuscript is as strong as possible. It then is accepted, at which point it comes to my desk. And what I'm essentially trying to do is create a metadata file that describes where the samples originated, what was done to those samples to make them to that digital data file at the end, and where those data files live. So that's the file that I'm creating. However, while I'm doing that, what happens is the manuscript gets reread. I check the data archive. It does, I kind of give it almost a second review in a way, but it's more of a technical review. Does it actually match? Does it make sense? Do the descriptions make sense? And often at this stage, we pick up really minor issues with the data, the tables in the manuscript, which are just usually typos or just human error, but they're very easily fixed, but we can fix them at this stage. And the idea being that when it gets to publication, we've got something that is immediately ready to reuse. So we accept the majority of things that go out to peer review. We accept 93%. But why might you reject a data paper? So essentially, at that beginning stage, as I explained earlier, it's out of scope, or sometimes people send us what they call a data descriptor, and there is no data there. So obviously, we can't accept that. If it's rejected after review, this is because there have been some serious flaws in the study design. There might be controls missing, or there's some serious issues identified, and I've got an example of that in just a minute. Options that authors have after rejection, well, they can just address the concerns and resubmit, and many people do that, and we wouldn't call that a rejection, but that means that if you're a reasonably competent scientist, you should be able to write a data descriptor about your data set and get it published, which kind of makes sense. But you've also got the option to submit elsewhere, if you have uploaded data to the integrated repository, you have two repositories that are integrated with scientific data, Figshare and Dryad. You can take your data out of that and then do what you will with it. Essentially, this is what we're trying to, what's in red here is data should be technically reliable and suitable for use by others. This is an example of something that was rejected after data peer review. So the reviewer said, in this case, the reviewer actually took the data and reanalyzed it and created this graph. And for someone who is not a physical scientist, maybe this doesn't make sense, so I've put this up. So this is what the graph should look like. This is what the kind of radiation we get from the sun, basically coming down to Earth. Now, the ozone layer soaks up most of this, so we really shouldn't get negative peaks here. And as the reviewer says, the negative spectra are unphysical. There's something seriously wrong with this data set. So clearly this was rejected. Okay, so just to summarize. So the data archive itself is checked multiple times at scientific data. The scientific reasoning as to, the experiment itself is checked by active researchers. The technical validity of the data is checked by experts, so they might be the actual curators at the repository, or they might be the discipline experts as reviewers. We check the data citations at several points too, because we want to make sure that the link between paper and data is really strong. So it's checked by myself at the point at which I've finished metadata. I'll check that the data citation is accurate. There's no typos in the accession IDs, for example. The format's checked by the editorial team, and then the linkage itself is checked again at production. So when the paper is actually published, all of this should be in place. Hopefully I've shown you the data peer review doesn't have to be a big undertaking. It can be done in a quite guided and not overwhelming way for reviewers. And especially, as I showed you in the last example, you can save time. In that case, the reviewer, just by looking at the data, could say, there's no point in me even reading the paper because clearly this isn't right. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Varsha, for that great introduction into reviewing something that is not a traditional article. And now I'd like to welcome Gino, who's the managing editor of Palgrave, can't even pronounce it now, Palgrave Communications, to look at peer review within another discipline, so the social sciences and humanities. Thank you.
Okay, so my intention is to look at peer review in the humanities and social sciences, or HSS, as I'll call it. Clearly, HSS encompasses a huge range of fields, all with very different research cultures and methodologies and so on. So necessarily, the comments I'll make are going to be generalized, but hopefully, they'll still be useful. I think it's important to say that the aims of peer review in HSS are clearly the same as they are in STM, to assess quality, relevance, potential impact. So the ultimate outputs are exactly the same, and the framework of peer reviewers is pretty much the same as well. So what my aims are really in this presentation are to offer a general overview really of HSS publishing practices, before moving on to look at some of the particular challenges that might face editors, reviewers, and authors. I'll have a look at some alternative peer review models, and there are many of those, and I'm not going to look at all of them. Instead, I'm going to focus specifically on the idea of open peer review, and I'll offer a few case studies undertaken by Palgrave Macmillan in the last couple of years. And then I'll offer some reflections on the way ahead. So just before we get started, this is Palgrave Macmillan's portfolio. We have journals, over 50 journals covering humanities, social sciences, and business studies. And then we also have longer formats as well, so books, monographs, handbooks, and what we call pivots, which are sort of mid-range formats, but somewhere between a journal article and a monograph. Okay, so a few comments just to sort of offer some context. Long-form communications are very important to the HSS publishing landscape, and in particular in the humanities where monographs really dominate. It's less so in the social sciences, but it is discipline specific. And I think it's really important to remember that when talking about peer review in HSS, because the peer review has to take in journal articles, but also monographs. And although the basic structures are the same, there are clearly different sorts of challenges involved. Double-blind peer review is the most common form for journals. There are some exceptions, but generally it's double-blind. For monographs, it tends to be single-blind. There are a few exceptions, such as there are some North American legal journals, for example, which don't use peer review at all, but they're generally an exception. Review timeframes are often longer in HSS. Again, it depends on disciplines. Clearly, that has to do with a few factors. Monographs sometimes are 150,000 words. It takes longer to review and digest those sorts of works, clearly. But there may also be cultural reasons too. The sort of the urgency to get work out there and publish, the sense of sort of immediacy is perhaps less in some particularly humanities disciplines than it is perhaps in STM. So that sometimes has a sort of it plays a part too. And citation rates are often slower in HSS. But HSS works often, and again, this is a generalization, but they often have longer shelf lives or half-lives. History research, for example, tends to get read longer than, say, your average perhaps paper in biomedicine, for example. So what do Palgrave Macmillan's authors tell us about peer review? Well, by and large, it falls within the top 3 reasons that authors look for when deciding on where to publish their work. Peer review is clearly very important. That's unsurprising. Also unsurprising is that there's frustration about turnaround times and also the efficiency of the process. And they also tell us that they're keen for publishers to innovate when it comes to peer review models. What precisely they mean by innovate isn't always very clear, but clearly that there is a sense there that we should perhaps be trying other models. So some common editorial challenges, and we could talk endlessly about these, and I haven't got the time really to delve into them. I'll pick up on a couple. Clearly, objectivity and quality of reviews, as we've heard already, is very important. There are particular challenges in HSS, for example, on book series sometimes. You have a series editor on a book series, and they perhaps over-rely, perhaps, on a small pool of reviewers for that book series. And that can often lead to superficial reviews. It can lead to reports being produced by authors, reviewers who perhaps aren't necessarily expert in that immediate area. So that's a sort of common issue with book review, for example. But there are lots of other issues that we could talk about. I think another interesting one is the assessment of non-mainstream work. So you could think, for example, of interdisciplinary research here. Clearly, research, for example, in very interdisciplinary areas like medical humanities or environmental sociology or digital humanities needs to bring in the perspectives of individuals and academics from very different disciplines. And editors then have to grapple with those different perspectives when making a final editorial decision, and that isn't always easy at all. So that's a common issue. And that's a particular one of interest to me because I work on an interdisciplinary journal and we grapple with this quite often. And then lastly, reviewer recognition, I think is worth pointing out. There are lots of different ways of recognizing reviewers' contributions. Payment is quite common in HSS for book review. but not for journals. So that sometimes comes into it too. So improving the peer review process, well, it's clear that the traditional model has some imperfections. We've heard a lot about that today. And that there's a desire from authors and academics for those to be ironed out in some way. And publishers clearly have an important part to play in tackling those. There are many publishers that are experimenting with piloting alternative peer review models. And most of these seem to be in STM, from what I can see. But there are some interesting ones that have occurred in HSS too, and I'm going to focus on those in the second part of the presentation. At Palgrave Macmillan, we've undertaken 2 pilots in recent years, one on monographs and one on journals, and I'll offer you some insights into how those went. So here are a few of the possible sort of permutations on the traditional peer review system. There are many others, I'm sure, and I'm not going to talk about all of these because that would be, there's too much to talk about. But instead, I'm going to focus specifically on open peer review and its sort of sibling crowd peer review, I guess. The interesting thing about open peer review, of course, is that it's a bit like Brexit. You ask 10 people what it means, and you'll get 30 or 40 answers. And I think it can mean lots of different things to different people. And particularly to authors, when authors are asked about open peer review, often we see sort of mixed responses. And I think that's partly because they're not actually sure what it necessarily means. So, but I'll focus on this for the rest of the presentation. So I think just building on that idea of what does openness mean, I think really it's a spectrum. And I think this sort of reflects that idea. I mean, openness can mean anything from openness around editorial governance. So, are you open about your editorial policies and decision-making on a journal? Right through to the idea of ditching double-blind peer review, through to private peer review, but in a larger group, or fully open peer review, where you actually allow pretty much anybody to comment on works, through to post-publication peer review, and perhaps even beyond. So it can mean a whole host of different things. So what are the arguments in favour of open peer review? And this is what some of the proponents say about it. And I'm sort of taking open peer review in its broader sense here. I think a few things to sort of focus on, and I'll not talk about each of these individually, but I think generally the idea, certainly in HSS, the idea sort of reoccurs quite often, is the idea that open peer review can allow us to reinvent the idea of what a peer is, what we mean by peer. So a peer doesn't necessarily have to be an academic. It could be somebody outside of the academic community. This is particularly relevant, I think, to some HSS areas. Theatre studies, for example, certain areas of literary criticism, where actually there are many individuals outside of academic circles who have valuable contributions to make. And also the idea that open peer review, it reflects the sort of discursive nature of academic inquiry. It's collaborative, it's interactive in some way. And also open peer review can be thought of as complementing certain movements in publishing, like open access publishing. It's important to note, though, that open access is much less developed in HSS, and there's a lot of reasons for that. So I think that's something sort of to bear in mind. So here's a few examples of where open peer review has been piloted or has been used on a regular basis in certain other outlets. And I won't talk about these individually, but what's interesting about these is that there's quite a lot of useful commentary that's emerged from editors or reviewers who've been involved. And we can get some useful insights into how well they've worked, what hasn't worked, what the challenges might be. An interesting one, I think, is the last one, the Italian Journal of Sociology. And they, for example, are holding, as I understand it, virtual meetings between authors and academics and individuals who are assessing the works. So that's sort of taken the idea of open peer review even one step further. And I think that's quite an interesting development. So here's a case study from Palgrave Macmillan sort of dabbling with open peer review. Back in 2014, we decided that we wanted to try open peer review on one of our on a cluster of monographs, 10 monographs, covering sociology, culture, and media studies. In this particular pilot, the open peer review took place after traditional peer review. So traditional peer review of the initial proposal, book proposal. The book had already been contracted for publication, and the authors had already begun writing their manuscript. But the peer review took place after that. This is one of the final books which was published. It generally went very well. It required quite a lot of legwork, as I understand it, on the editor's part, though. Perhaps more so than in a traditional peer review sort of model. We got 29 sets of comments in total, 14 open peer reviews. There were a couple of reviewers who weren't keen to participate in the open forum, but it was a minority, and it generally went very well. And what did the participants say? Well, one of the authors at the top here sort of, I guess, commented on this idea of the open peer review being sort of like an ongoing conversation, particularly as he was writing his manuscript. He felt it was a very useful, interactive sort of process. And then one of the reviewers, too, talked about how she felt that she could be a better reviewer by the process being open. And that was quite an interesting perspective, I think. So the second case study I want to offer is on one of our journals, in contrast. And this is our journal Post-Medieval, and this has actually been using open peer review on special issues since 2011, and they've now published 4 special issues that have used open peer review. They use very much a sort of a crowd peer review process whereby pretty much anybody can go in and comment on the works in question. And this is, you can see the interface that they use, and I think the interface is really important, I think, when talking about open peer review, because clearly it needs to be interactive. It needs to allow threaded comments. It needs to allow authors to respond to reviewers' comments, and perhaps even reviewers to reviewers' comments. And in this case, that is allowed. And here's a statement from the editor's sort of foreword to one of their special issues that used open peer review. And here they very much talk about, again, that idea of collaboration, of being able to bring in individuals who aren't necessarily within the academic community and their perspectives. So again, that sort of idea follows through. And they've published now 4 special issues, the latest being this summer. So what are the key lessons that we learned from our open peer review pilots? Well, authors were very keen and they generally really enjoyed it. As did the reviewers too. 75% in our monograph pilot said that they would be happy to participate again, which is great. But the editors sometimes felt that the comments, the level of comment, the detail in the comments was not necessarily sufficient, and perhaps not sufficient enough certainly to replace a traditional model of peer review. It's often hard to secure comments too. There was a lot of legwork needed on the part of the editors in order to get reviewers to contribute, particularly in a crowd format perhaps, where there's perhaps not, there's perhaps less of a, I don't know, a sense on the reviewers' part that they need to contribute because they maybe think that many other people are going to. So it's sort of, that's an interesting psychological angle, I guess. And I think future pilots could really think about at what point in the process we want to introduce open peer review. Is it before traditional peer review? Is it after? Is it instead of? So open peer review, I think just a few more reflections. As I understand it and as I see it really from the pilots that have been undertaken so far, I think it certainly can go some way to solving some of the traditional problems that we see with peer review, but perhaps in doing so it might actually create some new ones. And that's not to say that it isn't worthwhile exploring, but I think we need to be mindful of that. So I'm just thinking about it from 3 different perspectives. From an editor's perspective, might it change your role as an editor if reviews are in an open format, in an open forum? Does it change your behavior in some way? And I think that's worth considering. For reviewers as well, might it change your willingness to comment on somebody's work, particularly if you're perhaps a less experienced researcher? Might you be sort of, I don't know, fearful of critiquing a more experienced researcher's work if your name is going to be out there? And lastly, for authors too, I mean, if your work is rejected after having been peer-reviewed in an open forum, might that sort of diminish your likelihood of wanting to be part of an open peer-review project? And there's more we could say on that, and I think I'll probably leave that there. So in summary, I think HSS and STM certainly see many of the same challenges, and I think some of them are certainly discipline specific, and I couldn't really go into the details of those today. But generally, the challenges are the same, and much of that has to do with a large amount of pressure on the peer review system as a whole. Publishers have an important part to play, I think, in exploring alternative models that might address some of these inherent problems in the traditional system, and we're already starting to see that, which is really good. But actually, some of those alternative models may create new challenges that we need to confront. And I think to finish, I'll quote from a British Academy report of 2007, which recommended a system of decentralized diversity as the way ahead. So I think as publishers, we need to make sure that we don't keep all of our eggs in one basket. We need to be exploring these other models, and certainly models that embrace the principles of timeliness, transparency, and verifiability, of course. Okay, thank you.
Well, thank you very much to all our speakers. Now, as you've probably heard from the clamour outside, we've crashed into the tea and coffee break. So I think we will pend questions, if you don't mind, but you know that you now have the identity of the 5 speakers, so please do waylay them on the outside as you leave the room. And just to say, if you're interested in the topic, don't forget Peer Review Week, which is next week, and there's lots going on. So please do participate, and thank you very much for listening. And please share with me in thanking the speakers again.